Good evening, everybody. I hope you all have a seat and are comfortable. You're in for a treat tonight. All of you that are here are going to be very, very happy that you came when it's over this evening. We have some dignitaries here. We have some elected officials here. We have an unelected legislator. Where are you, Doris Goodale? I want you to stand up so everybody. Okay, Doris Goodale is here. Okay, Joe Hart, our mine inspector, state mine inspector, is here. I'm Joy Bretherton, Mohave County Supervisor in District 4. And we have Hildy Angus over here, Mohave County Supervisor in District 2. Okay. And we are very, very pleased tonight to have our guest, Representative Ken Ivory from Utah. He's currently a Republican member of the Utah House of Representatives. He's a committee member on the Judiciary Committee, Public Utilities and Technology, and Subcommittee on Public Education, Appropriations. He introduces and moderates the panel, Reclaim Our Western Lands. And he is the founder of our American Land Council. And he has a real, I could go on for a long, long time telling you all of these things that he has done. He has a BA from Brigham Young University and from California Western School of Law. He practiced business law in Las Vegas, Nevada. He lives in Utah with his wife and 4 children, where he operates his own business in estate planning and mediation practice. He is a partner with the law firm Ivory Law PC in West Jordan, Utah. And there is a gentleman from Apache County. He's one of the supervisors from Apache County, and his name is Barry Weller. Barry, will you stand up, please? And he has been traveling with Ken Ivory for some time now on this tour that they've made, and he can certainly tell you a lot more about Ken than I can. So Barry, will you come and say a few words, please?
Thank you, Supervisor Bretherton. As she said, I'm Barry Weller from Apache County. The last time I was here, I was talking to you about the wolves that are being introduced from our federal government to our backyards. And I appreciate your support at that time and listening to the issues that we're dealing with, and I felt a very warm welcome. And I'm happy and blessed and privileged to be back. I am back here by choice to support the gentleman that is here tonight, Representative Ken Ivory from Utah, because I believe in what he's doing and what he's saying and what he's teaching. I started to introduce myself to this issue almost 2 years ago, and I have been working with Mr. Ivory for over a year at this point in trying to help develop an understanding here in the state, and things are starting to take off. What I want you to know personally is he is a man of sacrifice for our country. He does have a family at home that he would rather be with, and he's here. And I've been traveling with him all this week, and he is a man who travels without sleep and without food, and all I'm doing is trying to help keep him going because he's got such a great message. I'm going to turn it over to him, but as I do that, you'll see my wife and I are going to start to pass some cards out so you have a little bit of literature and information, contact information. But Ken likes to get your contact information. Please, if you would like any information, and you will get gobs of information if you put a clearly written, distinct email address on here as I pass it around. So I'll start it over here and go up and around and come back down. If you get missed in any way, kind of wave at me, and I'll try to stay over here and keep track of any newcomers that come in for information. But without further delay, I'll turn it over to Representative Ken Ivory, and you are in for a treat.
Thank you, Supervisor Weller. Is this, we on? Oh, there we go. Good. Thank you, Supervisor Weller. He's been fantastic. We've learned a great deal from Apache County on the things that are facing our nation, the things that we know that are going on. Like he said, I would rather not be here, to tell you the truth. As honored as I am to be here with you, I'd rather be home. I'd rather be going to scout camp and girls camp, and I'd rather be hunting or fishing or hiking or something like that, but we have work to do, don't we? So I want to clarify just one thing, that I didn't start the American Lands Council. I passed a bill to transfer the public lands, to begin to compel the federal government to transfer the public lands to our state, just like they did with all states east of Colorado. And after I passed a bill, I had county commissioners and supervisors from 3 different states come to me and they said, Representative Ivory, you went on offense. You're playing offense. We've been playing defense for 40 years and we're losing ground. And if we keep playing defense and we only stay on that one side of the court, how well is that going to work out? They said, we've got to go on offense to defend and protect our jurisdiction. And it was county commissioners and supervisors that formed the American Lands Council. And then they said, would you leave your law practice and go out and teach and represent us in this thing? And that tells you how much I failed the sanity test right from the outset. But no, I'm honored. I'm honored to be here with you. If you would please write as legibly as you can. When Supervisor Weller said gobs of information, we'll send you 1 email a week. We'll try to keep them in short little bites so that you can share them as much as you can with other people. If something really big comes up, we may send you a second email, but we'll try to keep them short and to the point, but break this information down so you can pass it along. What an amazing time. This is an amazing time. Matt, how do we get this? There we go. Got it. I was born in Utah, but I grew up in Tempe. I'd much rather come back in December than September, but it's great to be here. I love Arizona. I consider myself an Arizonan. But all of us, we've got an opportunity to do some things that will bring what I believe, and I think when we get done tonight, you'll see is the only solution big enough to actually fund the education of our children going forward, to better care for our lands and our forests that right now are being managed for maximum combustion, to protect access that's being shut off all over our western lands, to create real jobs, real full-time jobs, and grow local, state, and national economies. Let's kind of start off here. Let's see if we can get this to work. There we go. Look at that map, would you? I mean, that's the whole story right there. So the red, and I mean, you all know, but the red it's not the western states' aspiration for Verizon. You know? The red is the land that the federal government controls throughout the United States. Now, on the last night of our legislative session this year, I had a group of Boy Scouts from my district come up to the Capitol. And they said, Representative Ivory, tell us what you're working on. And I gave them one of these little cards that you have here. And I explained to them, you know, the red is what the federal government controls. And these 12 and 13-year-old Boy Scouts, what do you think their first question was? Why? 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 We're going to talk about that question. This whole journey that we've been on for a few years now is all about that one question, why? Pretty good question, don't you think? Have you ever asked anybody that question and really expected an answer? That's going to be your homework assignment from now on. I want you to know I'm going to inflict you. I'm going to curse you tonight with information. And then what you do with it is your responsibility. And then I'm going home.
It is Friday the 13th.
It is. And so I'm going to curse you tonight. I just want you to know that at the outset. We're going to curse you with information and then with responsibility. And what we do with it. But it's like Ronald Reagan said, there are no easy answers, but there are simple ones. Let's look at some of that, okay? Why? Why? And the other thing at the outset, we're going to end at a point where I'm going to ask you to take that question, and there are going to be a lot of people next year that are going to want to work for you. There are going to be people in cities and counties and states in the House and the Senate and the Attorney General and the Governor and in Congress that are going to want to work for you. And you have an opportunity to conduct a job interview. And in that job interview, you have the opportunity to ask some very meaningful questions. Why the difference? What are you specifically going to do about it? Who else are you going to bring to the table? And what can I do to help you? That's a job interview right there. We're going to talk about that tonight, okay? So let's get rolling. These are the 4 things we're going to try to cover. And if we don't get there, you let me know and we'll cover it some more if I don't wear you out as we get through these things. But 4 main points. Federal land management is threatening Western communities and it weakens our nation. History and the law and the terms of statehood, our statehood agreements, obligate the federal government to dispose of the land. This isn't just some nice thing we're trying to do. There's an obligation that predates our nation, the founding of our nation, for the federal government to dispose of the public lands. We're going to talk about that. It's already been done before, repeatedly and recently. And this is the only solution big enough. We have a window of opportunity right now, the only solution big enough to actually fund the education of our own children in our own state, to govern ourselves, to better care for our lands and our forests, protect the access to our lands, create jobs, grow local, state, and national economies. Okay, let's see if we can get there from here. This was done earlier this year. This is a legal analysis done by the Federalist Society. It's a nonprofit organization of 40,000 constitutionally focused lawyers, scholars, and professors. They looked at what we've done in Utah with this Transfer of Public Lands Act, and now 5 states have passed similar legislation. They've looked at that and did a full analysis, legally, historically, constitutionally focused. In fact, this is just a quick outline of what they've gone through, that what we're doing is distinct from any prior efforts that states have done to secure their statehood right to their lands within their boundaries. This isn't Sagebrush Rebellion 2. This is very distinct, legally, constitutionally focused. It's based on our Enabling Act. The Enabling Acts, the Supreme Court has said repeatedly, are solemn compacts. Not just an agreement, not just any agreement. It's an agreement between sovereigns. And they call that a solemn compact. Something a lot more important than just a contract. And they said these solemn compacts are serious and enforceable on both sides. Now, on one side of that agreement, the states agreed to give clean title to the federal government as a trustee. You know the value of clean title, right? Imagine you have a piece of land and the title's all clouded. It's going to take you longer to sell it. You're not going to be able to sell it for as much money, right? Same idea. The language in our Enabling Act, the state said, we forever disclaim all right and title. Well, that was term of art language. In history, and you will see as we go through this, that was language where we said, we'll give the federal government clean title because it's duty bound to dispose, and so it's going to dispose faster and for more money. Because and if you see their duty in the Enabling Act says, until title thereto shall have been extinguished. Because as the federal government disposes for more money, right in the Enabling Act, 5% of that they're bound to pay that to the state for the education of our kids. We'll see that as we go along. Also, as they dispose of it more quickly, guess what? We get to generate tax revenue. And at the local level, we get to generate revenues off the lands. It was to our benefit as a state, and you'll see all the states, to give the federal government clean title as a trustee to dispose of that land. Because the faster they sell it, the sooner we get to generate revenue from the land. The more money they sell it for, 5% of those proceeds, by obligation in the agreement, are to come to the permanent fund for education. Michigan Journal of Environmental and Administrative Law. Michigan Journal of Environmental and Administrative Law looked at what we're doing and said, this is no laughing matter. There will be people that will say, oh, charge in the hill. That's already been done before. It's tried and it's failed, and this is Sagebrush Rebellion, and you're just jousting at windmills. The Michigan Journal of Environmental Administrative Law says this is no laughing matter. Hopefully at the end of the day you'll see that. If you'd like a copy of this, if you text and you'd like to get on a list where we've got some informational texts that come through and some videos and whatnot, if you text the word land to 58885, and you can share that with others. Actually, on that little card, on the back of that little card, we got those printed really fast before we kind of had our texting system worked down. And so as we get those cards, the new ones we'll put on the back of there, text the word land to 58885. So if you want to cross that out and write that in, that'd be fine. So here's where we started. When I was elected to the Utah House in 2010, the reason I was crazy enough to leave my law practice and go do that was I realized that we're in some trouble, that our states are dependent on the federal government for a good portion of our revenue in our states, and that the federal government is basically fiscally suicidal. And I wanted to know how dependent our state is. And so within the first 2 weeks after being elected, I went to the state auditor and said, I want to know the number, because I kept hearing things like, well, it's 20% or it's 15% or it's 25%, and nobody knew. I said, we really ought to know how bad it is so we know what to deal with it. Turns out in Utah, we're 45% dependent. 45% of our state revenues come from a federal government that in its own consolidated financial statements tells us that it's unsustainable. Something that's unsustainable, by definition, will end. Imagine in your business that 45% of your revenue comes from one customer that's bouncing checks to the payday loan company. And you go to your boss or your board of directors and you say, hey, I know we got this one customer that accounts for 45% of our revenue, but let's just keep doing what we're doing. What could go wrong with that? This is where we are in our states. I'll show you Arizona's situation here in just a minute. That's what got us started. And so after my first session, we realized how bad it was. And I went to our director of school trust lands and the chairman of our natural resources committee and said, in the off season here, can we get together and figure out what we can do? And our lands and the resources in our lands are the only solution big enough to take on that problem. We got $5 billion that comes from out of a $13 billion budget that comes from a federal government that's broke. You're not going to tweak the tax code and close that gap, ever. We have $2.6 billion in Utah. We're below funding in per pupil funding in education by $2.6 billion, just to get to average. Now, how many of you, when you send your children out or your grandchildren out, you say, honey, just go out there and try to be average today, would you? We're $2.6 billion away from average. There's no way you're going to tweak the tax code and get there from here. So we said, we got to figure out how to look at this question of our resources. I know it's been tried before. I know people have charged that hill and it hasn't worked, but there's no other way around this. And we can see what's coming. This is a math problem now. It's not a politics problem. This isn't Republicans and Democrats. This is how we educate our children and take care of our sick people and poor people and transportation and public safety. No matter what happens in Washington, that falls right here. How are we going to get there from here? And so we sat down and started to meet, and the director of our school trust lands, just as we started, first meeting, he says, you know, this was in 2011. He says, you know, there's a case just a couple of years ago, unanimous Supreme Court case that had something to do with the public lands. I said, give me that case. The case he got to us was this case called Hawaii versus the Office of Hawaiian Affairs. Let me tell you just a little bit about the case, okay? 1893. Industrial powers took the land away from the Native Hawaiians, gave it to the federal government. Native Hawaiians were not pleased. As they started going along and they had discussions about becoming a state, Native Hawaiians mobilized their courage and said, you're going to dispose of all that land to our state. We're not going to tolerate you hanging on to the land as some kind of a trustee or whatever. You're going to dispose of all the land to the states. And you're going to see that they succeeded in doing that. So in their statehood agreement, all the land, all the public land, was transferred directly to the state of Hawaii in 1959. Hawaii holds the land, right? So now fast forward to 1993. 1993, U.S. Senator Daniel Inouye runs an apology resolution in Congress. Apology resolution goes something like, whereas, now therefore, we apologize to the Native Hawaiians, and nothing in this resolution that we've done will disparage or impair any of the claims that the Native Hawaiians have against the federal government. Right? So now the state of Hawaii over here, a couple years after that, they decide to go sell some of their land. Well, the Native Hawaiians, through the Office of Hawaiian Affairs, come up with this idea that somehow this unilateral act of Congress, 30 some odd years after their statehood solemn compact, gives them a lien right over this land. And they go to Hawaii District Court and they claim a lien on that land based on this unilateral act of Congress. And the Hawaii District Court dismisses the case. They appeal it to the Hawaiian Supreme Court. And the Hawaiian Supreme Court says, oh yeah, that subsequent unilateral action of Congress gives them a lien right over this land based on the, even overriding the solemn compact of statehood. Goes to the United States Supreme Court on that question. The United States Supreme Court in 2009 unanimously held this: the consequences of a state's admission into the Union are instantaneous. And it ignores the uniquely sovereign character of that event to even suggest that somehow subsequent acts of Congress can diminish what was already bestowed at statehood. And that proposition applies with even greater force and effect where virtually all of a state's public lands are at stake. Think about what they said. Congress does not have the authority by some unilateral policy to change that solemn compact of statehood, particularly where public lands are at stake. That makes sense, doesn't it? If Congress can just on its own enact some policy whenever it wants and say, hey, we're changing the nature of your statehood, what's a state? What's the point in being a state? The Supreme Court declared that just 4 years ago. In our case, it was two years after the case. And we said, based on that, we said, that opens the door for a new look at this. That opens the door. And we looked at that, and now we started down this investigation that we're going to talk about tonight. We started looking at the why questions, those critical why questions. And I went to my Attorney General and said, look at this. It's time to start moving on this. And we assembled a group. We had folks from our governor's office, our Attorney General's office, our congressional delegation, the Farm Bureau, the ranchers, the recreation community, the education community, and we got together and started formulating this bill and working on how to create a demand, a meaningful demand, and a deadline for the federal government to work with us as a governing partner for an orderly transfer of the public lands to our state, to honor the same promise to Utah that it already kept with all states east of Colorado and with Hawaii. That's where this all started. Now let's look at this right here. We're pretty proud of this guy. This is George Sutherland. He is the only United States Supreme Court justice from the state of Utah. Think about what he said here. Man has three great rights, three great unalienable rights, endowed by a creator with three great unalienable rights: life, liberty, and property. Declaration of Independence said pursuit of happiness. All of the other state constitutions said life, liberty, and property. In the Declaration, they said pursuit of happiness. They didn't want to confuse the slave question. Life, liberty, and property. And these three rights are so interconnected as to be a single right. Because you see, if you give a man his life, but you deny him his liberty, it takes away all that makes life worth living. If you give him his liberty, but you take from him his property, which is the fruit and the badge of his liberty, you still leave him a slave. What's happening to our property? This is why property is so fundamental to our system. It's inherent in our American DNA, life, liberty, and property. Think about why, right? If I control my property, my labor, my sweat, the things that I accumulate, my thoughts, the things that I generate, and I control that, now I have choices. I have a lot of choices. I can choose to bless your life. And perhaps you may choose to bless my life with something that I value more than what I gave you. See what we just did there? We just created wealth. That's economics 101 right there. If I have choices, and the more choices I have, the more I can choose to bless your life. I may choose to bless your life for nothing in return, except for the return of the spiritual value that I have of doing something for you that you can't do for yourself. You're still better off because you've been blessed, and now you feel the obligation to pay that forward. But if I just take from you and give to her, you're no better off. Neither are you. Because there's no sense of that spiritual obligation, that moral obligation to go pay it forward to someone else. Right? That's what our nation was founded upon, property. And with those basic fundamentals of life, liberty, and property, we became the most wealthy, free country the world has ever known. Now think about what it said in the Declaration of Wealth as well. To secure these rights, governments, plural, are instituted among men. Supervisor, what's your job? Number one, secure these rights. Mayors and city councils and state representatives, what's your job? Secure these rights. Of course, fill the potholes. But secure these rights. That's why government exists. Because with those rights secured, we can bless each other's life, we can create wealth. And that's where it starts, right? So look where we are now, though. This is John Kenneth Galbraith, world-renowned economist in the mid-'80s, made this statement. Where socialized ownership of land is concerned, only the USSR and China can claim company with the United States of America. Think of that statement. And from the time that he said this in the mid-'80s, China and now Russia have been trying to liberalize the use of property because they know that's how you produce wealth. The more choices I have with respect to my property, the more wealth we can create. And we've been going the other way. We've been going the other way. So think about this. I used to work for the mayor of the city of Osaka in the International Relations Department in Japan. In Japan, W. Edwards Deming is something of a saint. So I see some heads nodding, right? Total quality management, just-in-time inventory. This is the guy, right? Think about this statement. Think about this. Every system is perfectly designed to achieve the results that it gets. Right? Every system is perfectly designed to achieve the results that it gets. What results are we getting? We have a system problem. Right? So here, let's talk about some of these results. Arizona, $31.5 billion in revenue. Now, of course, we don't budget all of the revenue that a state has. That's some magic of government. But the revenue, the total revenue of the state, $31.5 billion, 16.3 of it comes from a federal government that's broke. I'm feeling really good right now. Utah's only 45% depend on the federal government. Arizona's 52. 52% of your revenue comes from a federal government that's broke. It comes from a federal government that has a vertical curve on its accumulation of debt. It comes from a federal government that is overspending the deficit, right? The debt is the accumulation, 17 trillion. That's just the official debt. You still have the unfunded obligations that go into the hundreds of trillions. The annual deficit, the annual overspend, what we hear in the headline numbers is $1 trillion. Now that's horrible, don't get me wrong. Any idea how long it takes to count to $1 trillion?
Lifetime.
Right, lifetimes? 32,000 years to count to 1 trillion, right? On a generally accepted accounting principles basis, the way we have to do our accounting in our businesses and our counties and our states, you book your obligations. You have to have the money to cover the obligations that you incur, right? We have 10,000 baby boomers retiring a day. And so you book the revenue, you book the expense for that obligation. Federal government doesn't do that. They're the only one in the nation that doesn't. Everybody else, if you don't do it, you go to jail. On a generally accepted accounting principle basis, booking all of the obligations, the annual overspend is something north of $5 trillion a year. And this is how we're taking care of it. Right? Didn't we learn that? If you don't mind, can we take questions at the end? Imagine what your parents and grandparents would have said if you said, hey, you know what? I'm just going to go along with pretending that we can print prosperity. That's what we're doing. We're just going to print. We're going to borrow and print prosperity. We're not going to do this. We're not going to control property and work and labor and control and then exchange. We're going to pretend that we can print prosperity. $85 billion a month. How long till we run out of runway? How long until the US dollar, that is the reserve currency for the world, which is the only reason that we can pretend to print prosperity, is no longer accepted by nations of the world for the real stuff that they produce? I don't know. My guess is time is running short. In fact, All of the nations of the world, hundreds of them have tried this experiment. None of them have succeeded. They all fail miserably. And we're very far down that runway. Some of the other results that we're getting in this system. States in the West have the hardest time to fund education because counties like Gila have 3.8% taxable land. How do you have nowhere else to go. You have nowhere else to go. Matt, if we could cue up the little 1-minute video of Congressman Rob Bishop.
Control. Now I want you to look carefully at this map. See where the red is, and then I also want you to look at this particular map. States in red are the states that have the hardest time funding their education system. That is the slowest growth in education. I hope you realize there is a similarity between the two particular maps, because the bottom line is individuals in the West pay more in state and federal taxes than in the East. There are more kids in the West. We have larger class sizes in the West. Our education system has a harder time to fund itself in the West because this map prohibits us from developing our property taxes, developing our energy royalties, developing high-paying jobs with income taxes, so kids are hurt in the West. I'm sorry, this map and this situation means that kids are underfunded. Can I get
50 seconds. Gentleman's recognized for 30 seconds.
Kids in the West, their education is underfunded, their teachers' salaries are depressed, and my retirement is threatened because of this particular situation. You control. Now, I want you to look carefully.
Thank you. This is where we are. Now, 237 years ago, we solved a very important question, and we did it in a way that no other nation ever has. We solved the question of whether we can govern ourselves or we must be governed by some self-anointed governing angel. And by virtue of a revolution, we answered the question that is part of our American DNA, that we can govern ourselves. That question has already been decided. And yet, with our children, we have the opportunity to govern ourselves, and this is where we are in the West. Now, I'll tell you that when I'm up in Idaho, speaking in Idaho, they say, yeah, no, that doesn't reflect us. The best answer I have from them so far is that there was some one-time anomaly, one-time surplus of funds, and so in the year that this data came out. If you look at North Dakota as well, we're going to talk about North Dakota a little bit. North Dakota now is putting billions of dollars right into classrooms. They're putting billions of dollars into capital improvement of schools and roads. They have thousands, tens of thousands of jobs just looking for people to take them because they have access to all their lands and they get 100% of the royalties from what comes off their lands. So we also have this situation. Top map, wildfires more than 250 acres. Look at the similarity. Come on, there's no similarity there. What are you talking about? I'm sure it's just a coincidence. Wildfires more than 250 acres, and then our Western States Verizon map. It's incredible, isn't it? This just came out last year. Last year, the FBI and the Department of Homeland Security sent criminal activity alerts out to all of the state foresters throughout the West. When they captured Osama bin Laden, they found it. They got a treasure trove of documents. In the documents, they found the terrorism plans to use wildfire as a form of jihad, and that they're publicizing throughout their networks. We're being warned by the FBI. They are publicizing throughout their terrorism networks to use wildfire as a form of jihad. And this is the terrorist map. Because we've given them the fuel. Think about this for a second. I see a few cowboy hats in the room. So suppose you've got a pen or a corral that holds about 40 or 50 head of cattle. But you get the bright idea that you're going to put 500 head in there, and you put a 55-gallon barrel of water, and that's it, and you just leave them. They're going to get sick, they're going to die, right? You put 500 head in there, and they're going to get sick, and they're going to die. Think about our forests. An acre of forest land in the West has a sustaining capacity of about 50 trees to an acre. And right now, federal forest policies say you can't harvest a tree, and we have 700, 800, 1,000 trees to an acre, all with a finite amount of water, and those living organisms are going to get sick, and they're going to die. and they're dying all over the West, and we still can't harvest a tree even after they're dead, in most cases. And so now we have dead wood sitting in the forest all throughout the West, just waiting for a lightning strike, or otherwise. And now the fires are burning in at an intensity that they never have before. We've got the crown fires that, when I drove, I grew up in Tempe. And we used to go up into the White Mountains to get away from the heat. And I was here about a year ago up in Apache County with Supervisor Weller and others up there looking at the Wallow Fire and what happened there and how devastating that was. 500,000 acres. And as I'm driving home, I'm driving from Show Low through Payson, and I called Supervisor Allen and said, "What in the world is this? I don't remember this. It looks like a moonscape." He said, "Oh yeah, that's the fire we had, 10 or 15 years ago." It's still not regenerating because the fires now are burning so hot with all that fuel buildup. They're sterilizing the ground 6 and 10 feet deep, decimating the watershed for generations, decimating a renewable resource for generations that used to go right into schools to fund education, used to go right into local communities, used to produce jobs that increase the tax base. Environmentalism? Really? This is happening right now. We can't afford not to manage our own lands. The environmental destruction that's out there right now. So here's that question, right, that we're going to ask. Why the difference? Why the difference? Well, there were a number of Western states that got fed up with this. And they got together. And they began sending petitions and delegations and resolutions to Congress and making demands. And they said, look, you're not disposing of our land like you promised. We can't tax the land to educate our kids. We can't grow our economies and provide good paying jobs, and you're hoarding all of our minerals and resources. Does that sound familiar? That was Illinois. That was Dick Durbin's state of Illinois. And it was Missouri, and it was Louisiana, and it was Arkansas, and it was Alabama, and Mississippi, and Indiana, and of course that great western state way over there of Florida. Right, Florida, in their resolutions to the United States, it's on the website. The documents are on the American Lands Council website. That great western state of Florida said, we're worse off than all the western states because you're not disposing of our land. The Illinois resolution, please go on the website and read them. On the front page of the website, there are a bunch of quick facts. And quick fact number 5, you can pull up the original documents and read them. They're right there. 90% federally controlled for decades. Illinois was, Missouri was, right? Until one man with courage stood up. And in his words, he went to battle. With the Democratic senator from Missouri, Thomas Hart Benton. In fact, his courage was so legendary that John F. Kennedy featured him in his best-selling book, Profiles in Courage. Thomas Hart Benton, look at what he says. My election to the Senate of the United States found me doing battle for an ameliorated system of disposing of our public lands. I resolved to move against the whole system. I did so in a bill renewed annually for a long time and in speeches which had more effect on the public mind than upon the federal legislation. Knowledge and courage. Over and over and over again. Members of Congress. How often do, unfortunately, we hear members of Congress say, you don't understand Washington, my dear boy. It's impossible. Knowledge and courage. One man. Did you notice today, if you look on your card, is Illinois 90% federally controlled? Missouri, Arkansas, Louisiana? Less than 5, significantly less than 5%. Imagine if one man had no knowledge and no courage and refused to do battle. And they were still 90% federally controlled today. Worse than Nevada. One man with knowledge and courage. The new states, right? Illinois, Missouri, right? The new states of the West were sufferers by this federal land policy. If you look down here, the majority of Congress was less heedful of their wants and wishes. Does that sound familiar?
Yes.
They were as a stepmother instead of a natural mother, the federal government being the sole purchaser from foreign nations and the sole recipient of Indian cessions. It became the monopolizer of the vacant lands in the West. And this monopoly, like all monopolies, resulted in a hardship. Does that sound familiar? Few or none of our public men raised their voice against this hard policy before I came into the national councils. My own voice was soon raised there against it, and it is certain that a great amelioration has taken place in our federal land policy during my time, and that the sentiment of Congress and that of the public generally has become more liberal in land alienations, knowledge, and courage. But the members of Congress, and I would submit the members of the city councils, and the Board of Supervisors, and the state representatives, and the attorneys general, and the governors, and the members of Congress should not intermit their exertions nor vary their policy, and should fix their eyes steadily upon the period of the speedy extinction of the federal title to all the lands within the limits of their respective states. It's been done before by Illinois, and by Florida, and by Alabama, and Mississippi, and Indiana. It's been done before. This isn't just ancient history, though. Remember Hawaii? This is the enabling act of Hawaii. Because the Hawaiians had knowledge, and they mobilized their courage, and refused to take no for an answer. And in their enabling act, it says that the United States grants to the state of Hawaii directly, effective upon its admission, the United States title to all the public lands, title which is held by the United States immediately prior to its admission, directly to the state. Michigan, 13 million acres were granted directly to the state of Michigan. Tennessee, here's all your land directly to the state. There's all sorts of different land grants. There was homesteading and a whole variety of different grants. You see, the federal government's duty was to dispose of the land. Selling was just one way of disposing. Their duty was to dispose. If you can sell, sell, but you must dispose. You must extinguish title. And in many cases, directly to the state. Why the difference? Now, 2 months ago, I was asked to participate on a continuing legal education panel. I'm a reforming lawyer, you see. And they invited me to be on this panel with a university law professor from University of Utah. This is the law professor that the newspapers like to quote as often as they can to say that this is clearly unconstitutional. Clearly unconstitutional. So I was excited to hear what he was going to say. I wanted to ask him why. So we're at this continuing legal education panel, 125 lawyers, and he stands up and goes first. And he stands up, and the first thing he presents, his first argument, he puts up this map. And this is the annual average precipitation in the continental United States. Now you see here, you see how it's different in the West than in the East? You see that? You see how there's kind of a division there somewhere? And you see that it's different over here in the West than it is over there in the East? You see that? Therefore, the federal government keeps those lands. You laugh. Are you not familiar with the arid clause of the Constitution? Don't go looking for that. You have to be a law professor to find that one. I'm serious. Totally serious. Now, unless you think this is an isolated incident, when we found that case, that 2009 Supreme Court case that says Congress doesn't have the authority to change our rights of statehood, particularly where our public lands are at stake, went to my attorney general and said, this opens the door, we've got to look at this, the promises are the same, why the difference? He says, God, I don't know. There's got to be a reason. There's got to be a reason that our lands are enslaved, remember, right? If you give a man if you give him his liberty but deny him his property, you take away the fruit and badge of his liberty and still leave him a slave. There's got to be a reason that we're enslaved. We can't govern ourselves. There's got to be a reason. Let's find someone that has more knowledge on this. And so we appealed to a retired 10th Circuit Court of Appeals judge and got him on the phone. And he was explaining to us, you see how the federal government is the manager of the land, and there's this case, and this case, and this case. By the way, the legal analysis, the Federalist Society legal analysis, through all those cases. You see, the federal government's the manager. It's the exclusive manager, without limit, to manage the lands. I said, Judge, I understand that it's the manager. But over here, the obligation to dispose of the land, the other side of that contract, the promise is the same. Why the difference? And the phone went silent. And he said, I've never thought of that question. I've never thought of that question. And see, the phone went silent again for a little bit, and he came back and he said, I guess it's because your land is so rugged. Therefore, Because, of course, the rugged clause is right next to the arid clause in the Constitution. If you're a law professor, you might be able to find that one. I mean, this was argument number one. Now, we laugh. How sad is it that we have never asked this question? To know that when they say clearly unconstitutional, that's argument number one. Now, argument number two is way better than that. Why the difference? Argument number two, he says, I have looked at the enabling acts, the solemn compact of statehood. I've looked at the enabling acts of all the Western states. And they all have these 7 magic words. Forever disclaim all right and title. The founding fathers of Arizona and Utah and New Mexico just gave up your land. You didn't want your lands. You didn't want that timber. You didn't want the minerals. You didn't want to govern yourself. They didn't want it. Makes sense, right? Please go like this. Right? But I looked at the enabling acts of all the Western states, and they all say this. You see right here, the people inhabiting said territory do agree and declare that they forever disclaim all right and title. And he sat down as if to say, I rest my case. And I got up and I said, wow. Forever disclaim all right and title. How would you ever overcome that? You know what? Maybe let's see here. That that's Alabama's enabling act. Remember, they were as much as 90% federally controlled, and they went to battle, and they're 2% public land. And their enabling act says forever disclaim all right and title. Then you have here forever disclaim all right and title. You see that? That's Louisiana's enabling act. They were another one of those back there. There was 90%, as much as 90% federally controlled for decades. And then you see right here, this is a forever disclaim all right and title to the unappropriated public lands. Well, that you see is Nebraska's enabling act. And they have 1% public land. Now, Nebraska's a really interesting story. Because if you think about Nebraska, you've got Nebraska over here and Nevada over here. Which one would you think was made a state first? You'd think Nebraska, right, over here, and Nevada over here, right? Well, you'd be wrong, of course, you know. Their enabling acts were less than 30 days apart. Word for word the same on the disposal of the public lands. Nevada was made a state in 1864. Nebraska wasn't made a state until 3 years later. Nebraska had more than 25% public lands at statehood, and they disposed down to 1. Nevada had 87% public lands at statehood, and today it still has 81% public lands. Why the difference? Now, of course, then you see the people inhabiting the proposed states do forever disclaim all right and title. You see, if you actually bother to read the whole sentence, I know it takes work. But if you read the whole sentence, it says, until the title thereto shall have been extinguished, the land shall remain subject to the disposition of the United States, which we're going to learn from one of your native Arizonans, meant that the public lands question is older than the nation, and the federal government was a trustee to dispose of the land. But if you read the whole sentence, you might discover that. Now, Arizona, but see, this enabling act, this is North and South Dakota. One enabling act created 2 states, but it doesn't stop there, because this one enabling act actually created 4 states. It's the same document that also created Montana and Washington, where the federal government controls 40% of their land still today. The same document. With 2 states they disposed of the public land, and with 2 they didn't. Why the difference? So this is Arizona's enabling act. You see, it's perfectly clear. If forever disclaim all right and title, it's perfectly clear that you gave up your land, of course, right? And then if you look at the rest of the document, 36% public land. It's not just the 36%. I had a county commissioner in Wyoming point out to me, they're about 40% public land. He said, it's not just the 40%. It's kind of like the property law of 2-year-olds, right? If it's mine, it's mine. If it's yours, it's mine. If I can see it, it's mine. If it touches mine, it's mine. If you have to go through mine to get to yours, it's mine.
That's the Marriage Act.
Isn't that how isn't that the public lands, right? anything that relates to it is subject to that control. And so the 36% kind of has that feels like temperature of 60%, something like that. Now, I know it was hard work to read the whole sentence. Imagine if you were to read the whole document. If you were to read the whole document, in Arizona's Enabling Act, it says 5% of the proceeds of the sales of public lands, which shall be sold, shall be paid to the state for the support of the common schools. Now, of course, if you're a law professor, any law professor knows that the word shall means may.
No, it doesn't.
Are you a law professor? This is the argument. This is the argument. Well, shall clearly means clearly. Of course, clearly. You've got to say clearly. Clearly means may. However, you remember that Michigan Journal of Administrative and Environmental Law? They examined the Enabling Act and all the shall words. There's about 80 shall words in the Enabling Act, and almost exclusively shall means shall. Go figure. But in order to come up with some kind of an argument that we cannot govern ourselves, that our land must be enslaved, we have to come up with these arguments to clearly show that shall means may. These are the arguments that we've been tolerating because we haven't been asking the simple question, why? This is just some of the examples of legal authority that is out there. Recently, the Supreme Court has repeatedly said that these solemn compacts of statehood are bilateral agreements, rights and obligations on both sides that are serious and enforceable to be performed in a timely fashion. At about the time of our statehood in Utah, the Supreme Court said that the federal government only held territorial lands in trust for the states ultimately to be created. Alabama, you remember Alabama, one of those states that was as much as 90% federally controlled, and they went to battle because they had knowledge and courage, right? This was a case related to Alabama and their lands. It says once the federal government, once the United States has fully executed these trusts, the municipal sovereignty of the new states, Illinois and Missouri and Arkansas, will be complete throughout their respective borders, and they and the original states will be on an equal footing in all respects whatsoever. The United States never held any municipal sovereignty, jurisdiction, or right of soil in and for the territory of the new states, except for temporary purposes to execute the trusts. You understand what a trust is, right? Anybody have a trust? You've been a trustee, right? The trustee holds legal title. Now, the trust agreement gives instruction as to what the trustee can and cannot do. In our law, that trust situation is known as fiduciary duty. It's also referred to as the highest duty known in law, the utmost good faith and loyalty. Because a breach of the trust is so serious when you've been entrusted with something like that. The federal government was only ever a trustee. They hold legal title. They do. That forever disclaim, we gave them a quitclaim. We cleared title at statehood to the federal government because they have an obligation to dispose of the land, to create new states, use the proceeds to pay the debt of the revolution. We'll see where this question is older than our nation. They hold title as a trustee to dispose of the land. Not go sell the land and book the cruise. Not go give the land to China. Or whatever else they may want to do. Utmost good faith and loyalty. So, some people have said, well, after your statehood, you just decided you didn't want it. Now that makes sense, doesn't it? Except that in 1915, within less than one generation from our statehood in Utah, 3 years from your statehood, our legislature in Utah sent a resolution to Congress saying, hey, you need to go back to that liberal policy, those compacts starting in 1780 that we'll look at here in just a moment. You need to go back and perform it. You need to do that duty. We have less than 1/3 taxable land. We can't educate our children. Get on with it. By the 1920s, all of the lower 48 are now states, and Arizona and New Mexico and all the western states got together and said, hey, you're not disposing of our land like you promised. We can't tax the land to educate our kids. We can't grow our economy, provide good paying jobs. You're hoarding all resources. Put pressure on President Hoover. President Hoover convened a commission for the disposal of the public lands. That commission led to congressional hearings, and if you can see at the top of the congressional record on the hearings that they held in 1932, do you see that? It says, granting remaining unreserved public lands to the states. Not if, just how. Now, the agencies that were working with the president on the commission, they proposed legislation, and their proposed legislation was, we're going to grant all the land to the state. That's our duty. It's a trust. We have to grant that land. We know that. We're going to grant you all of the surface rights. We'll just keep all the minerals. And the western states, in the middle of the Depression, mobilized themselves and descended upon Washington and said, I don't think so. You're not going to give us the burden without the benefit. Because in the western states, the value of the land is in the minerals. And they killed that attempt to change the obligation. Now, your own Thomas Maddock, original member of the Arizona legislature, he was a Colorado River commissioner and all kinds of other important things in Arizona. He was asked to address the Western governors in 1931, and his remarks are attached to this congressional record in 1932. He had things like this to say: the public land question is older than our nation. The pledge of the state lands to the nation provided the security upon which Hamilton established our credit, as well as settle the overlapping claims of the states to the territory west of the Allegheny Mountains. You see, here's what happened. You may ask the question, how did the federal government ever come to have title to these lands in the first place? Why did we ever get there, right? You go back to 1763. And in 1763, when the king granted the colonial charters to the colonies, he said, here's your colony, here's the boundary of your colony. And to 7 of them, he said, you can have claim over the western lands. 6 of them, no claims. You get the boundary of your colony. 7 of them have claims, that word, they use that word. 7 of you have claim over the western lands. 1776 now, right? Lives, fortunes, sacred honor. And they sign that pledge, and they look to Robert Morris, and they say, Robert, we want you to finance this operation. Why don't you run down to the First International Bank and just float a loan against the most powerful, well-equipped, well-funded, well-trained military in the world? Robert Morris funded the first $2 million of the revolution by himself in 1776. By 1780, Robert Morris is broke, and the nation, this group of states, is broke. The war is not over. Can you imagine? Can you imagine? The British are descending upon them. What are we going to do? What do states do when they need more money? They can't borrow, right? He just went down. He tried to go down, and who's going to? Would you loan money on that deal? You're out of money in 1780. You're out of money, and you got the British just steaming down on you.
Go to another country.
Go to another country. You're going to loan money on that deal? No. Raise taxes, perhaps, right? Raise taxes on the original Tea Party crowd. Are you going to do that?
Oh, no, print more money.
The 7 said, we're not going there. The 7 said, you know what? We have claims to these western lands. We'll sell our claims to the western lands. You 6, good luck. Imagine if you're one of the 6. Imagine if you're one of the 6. The 6 said, we're going to have to raise taxes. You're going to sell claims to the western lands? We're contributing our blood and treasure into this operation. Our people are going to leave our states because we're raising taxes. They're going to go to your states, and we're putting our blood and treasure into this, and you're going to be these big landed states at the end of this deal? It doesn't work for us. We're not good with this. Done. Imagine. Imagine. At the very birth of our nation, Continental Congress stepped up and said, we have an idea. Let us have the land. Time out. Fighting a war against a land baron. Our first act in the founding of our nation is not going to be the establishment of a land baron, no matter how perilous this is. Oh, no, no, no. What we meant to say, and they came back with a resolution in 1780. What we meant to say was, we'll hold these lands in trust. And with the emails that you'll do, I'll send you these slides, and unfortunately I tried to shorten this up, but it's just such good stuff. What The resolution says, is be it resolved that the unappropriated lands, which is the word that we still use today, because this is where the public land question started. Be it resolved that the unappropriated lands which shall be ceded to the United States by the states shall be disposed of for the common benefit, that meant to fund the war, and shall be formed into distinct republican states with the same rights of sovereignty, freedom, and independence as all the other states. And it'll be granted under such regulations as Congress may prescribe. Create new states, use the proceeds to pay the public debt, no other use or purpose whatsoever. On that basis, New York ceded its lands only to create new states, only to pay the debt, no other use or purpose whatsoever. 3 other states did the same thing before the Constitution. North Carolina and Georgia, they don't cede their lands until 1802. Georgia in 1802, they were the last one. Well, that's way after the Constitution. Why are they still doing that when we have a Constitution? You see in Article 6, Clause 1 of the Constitution, it says all engagements entered into before the Constitution shall be valid and binding after the Constitution. And in the Congressional Public Lands testimony and hearings in the 1830s, they call this one of the engagements that was the basis upon which states relied in ceding their land, which formed the very basis for the foundation of our nation. But for that, we may have perished at birth as a nation. That's how critical this public lands question is. This is where the public land question started. You're Thomas Maddock. I will show you, and again in the slides that we send to you, after they win the war, Thomas Jefferson drafts a land ordinance. And in the land ordinance drafted by Thomas Jefferson, he says, the new states shall never interfere with the primary disposal of the lands by the United States, nor with any regulations to secure title in the bona fide purchasers. Federal government's a trustee. Don't interfere with that. In the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, in July of 1787, same thing. The new states will be on an equal footing. Don't interfere with the primary disposal of the soil or with any regulations to secure soil in the bona fide purchasers. Federal government's a trustee. Don't interfere with that. Then you get to Article 4, Section 2 of the Constitution, known as the Property Clause. And it says Congress shall have the power to dispose of the territory and make needful rules and regulations, and Constitution shall be construed as to prejudice any claims. Remember that word claims from 1763 and 1780. Nothing in the Constitution shall be construed as to prejudice any claims of the United States or of the particular states. You see, that provision of the Constitution, they said, we already solved this public lands question back in 1780. That provision of the Constitution is simply to preserve the status quo. That's what the congressional debate on that section says. We're simply going to preserve the status quo on the western lands. The states took their claims in 1780 and they put them in trust. The United States as trustee had claim over those lands to use them as collateral to pay the debt of the war. Now look at what Thomas Maddock then says. He says, he quotes, in 1932, he quotes the Congressional Public Land Committee report from 1832. And he says, let me look over here. He says, the public debt now being paid, the only time in our nation's history in 1832, how would that be? The public debt now being paid, the public lands are entirely released from the pledge they were under to that object and are free to receive a new and liberal destination for the relief of the states in which they lie. The speedy extinction of the federal title within their limits is necessary to the independence of the new states. Without the extinction of title, the states are not free. The same rights of sovereignty, freedom, and independence, right? It's necessary to the independence of the new states and to their equality with the older states, to the development of their resources, to the subjection of their soil to taxation, cultivation, and settlement, and to the proper enjoyment of their jurisdiction and sovereignty. The ramified machinery, I had to look that word up. It's like this obsolete and sclerotic, bad, really bad. The ramified machinery of the Land Office Department and the ownership of so much soil extends the patronage and authority of the general government into the heart and the corners of the new states and subjects their policy to the danger of a foreign and powerful influence. This was your Thomas Maddock. But of course you just gave up your land. You didn't want it, right? So they stopped that horrible proposition that, yes, we'll keep our promise and we'll transfer the land to you, we'll just keep all the minerals, and the states in the middle of the Depression stopped that. Now, I've heard some people say, well, it was the Taylor Grazing Act. So 2 years after that, in 1934, Congress passed a stopgap measure to manage the public lands known as the Taylor Grazing Act. It's the precursor to the BLM. I've heard many say, oh, well, that's where the states gave up their land, in the Taylor Grazing Act, you see. Well, if you look at the first line of the Taylor Grazing Act, it says, in order to promote the highest use of the public lands, pending its final disposal. You see, the obligation that was undertaken in 1780 had been the same from 1780 through the Land Ordinance of 1784 and 1787 and the Constitution in 1787 and the Public Lands Committees in the 1830s and 40s and 50s when Illinois and Missouri and Arkansas exercised their knowledge and courage and succeeded in the transfer of their lands. And you see in those Supreme Court cases that we saw all the way up to our statehood and reiterated again in all of our statehood enabling acts that the federal government is obligated to dispose of the land. And we understood that, and Congress understood that all the way up until 1976, when they said it's now our policy to retain these lands in federal ownership. It's now our policy, our unilateral policy, to retain these lands in federal ownership. Never mind the solemn compact that formed the very basis of our nation in that perilous time of 1780. Never mind the Land Ordinance of 1784, 87, the Constitution, the court opinions, the Congressional Public Lands hearings, the fact that they did transfer the land to the other states and our statehood enabling acts. Throw all that out the window because we have a unilateral policy to retain these lands. 1976. In 1976. That's known as the Federal Land Policy Management Act. Now, lest you think that the benevolent federal government would not give you something in exchange for this deal that was imposed upon the states, here's the deal. We know that you could tax your lands and you could govern yourself and you could use your resources in your forest to educate your children and take care of your own communities, but we're going to pay you to not utilize your lands and resources. We're going to pay you to not tax your lands, and that's called payment in lieu of taxes or PILT. What that works out to be is about 13 cents on the dollar because you, dear supervisor, you would rather have 13 cents than a dollar, apparently. Also, we're going to pay you to not use your forest resources because we would rather allow the trees to build up and manage them for maximum combustion, and we would rather that you not govern yourselves and generate jobs and generate the tax revenue and the multiplier effect and the satisfaction of governing yourself. We'll pay you. Now that's called secure rural schools. Now I learned in law school, my tax professor in law school taught me that if you put the word not in front of any piece of federal legislation, you're going to be more accurate 90% of the time. So in the Not Secure Rural Schools Act, what they said is we will pay you to not utilize your forest resources. And that money would go right into schools and local communities. Now also, if you're North Dakota, remember North Dakota? You get to control 100% of the access to your resources, and you get 100% of the mineral royalties in your state. But if you're on the west side of that arbitrary federal fault line, you get to control 20%, 30% of the access to your lands perhaps. And we've got a deal for you. You'll get 48 cents instead of a dollar. Because you like 48 instead of a dollar, apparently. You get 48% of the mineral royalty in your state. That was the deal. But they also said in this deal that was imposed upon the states, you're going to have a multiple use and a sustained yield with local planning. Doesn't that sound great? How well is that working out? That was the deal. That was the deal, right? But now let's go forward and see what happened to that. We're going to get to this is a little 3-minute video of Senator Lisa Murkowski. She's the ranking member of the Senate Natural Resources Committee. This is just a couple of months ago, talking about this deal that was imposed upon the states. Matt, if you could cue that.
The community of Wrangell, where I went to elementary school, is a community where 64% of their budget for the school comes from Secure Rural Schools funding. when they don't know where 64% of their budget is going to be coming from on a year-to-year basis, it causes a great deal of stress. The PILT program, of course, is permanent, so we're not concerned about the program expiring, but what we are concerned about is the level at which the program is funded. PILT was created in 1976 by Congress because we changed our federal land policy from one that was focused on disposal to one that was focused on retention. These payments are literally payments in lieu of taxes to compensate our local governments for the loss in tax revenue caused by this change in policy. Secure Rural Schools, unlike PILT, was largely a replacement program for the receipt-sharing programs, whether it's the Forest Service payments to states and the Bureau of Management that Oregon and California have for their payments. These payments made under these programs were historically from receipts generated by timber sales for roads and school purposes. But I think we recognize that they were never intended to be a permanent entitlement program, but more specifically a temporary, short-term bridge to allow the communities to transition to the new economic reality that was forced upon them by environmental policies that were designed to halt timber harvesting. But if you're a community like Ketchikan, where I was born down in southeast Alaska, Ketchikan, their private taxable lands within the Ketchikan Gateway Borough are 0.3%. 0.3%. So if you have no other place to go, if 96.5% of the land in your borough is held by the federal government, the state has 1.3%, the local government has 0.3%, there is 0.3% that is taxable land. So when you say you've got this federal policy that says you can't harvest within the Tongass because we're just saying you can't harvest in the Tongass, and you have no place to go for your tax base, and we say, well, this is just going to be a temporary program for you until you can transition. The question is, what do you transition to? But I think we all know. I mean, we're having budget conversations this week. It's on everybody's mind. Federal government's broke here. We can't continue to pay counties to not utilize the lands within their boundaries. And, Mr. Chairman, you have appropriately suggested where we need to go with this. You need to be able to access the resources that are on your lands. We either need to utilize our federal lands to generate the revenue and the jobs for our rural communities, or we should divest the federal government of those lands and let the states or the counties, the boroughs manage them.
Right. That's Senator Lisa Murkowski from Alaska. Now, mostly right. Mostly right. But in 1976, she said, we changed our policy from one of disposal to one of retention. No, actually, you changed the very solemn compact that formed our nation and the Constitution and the court precedents and the enabling acts and everything else that went into that obligation from disposal to retention. But think of what she said. We imposed this policy until you could transition to the new economic reality. So if your state in Arizona, I was really impressed when we were down in the Senate rooms yesterday, and the seal of Arizona is all about the resources of the land. That is what the state was founded upon. And so we're going to take all that resource and tie it behind your back and say, transition to the new economic reality. And they said, we're going to pay you to not utilize your lands and resources. And she said, federal government is broke. By every objective measure, we know that. The American Institute of CPAs, our Utah Association of CPAs, they're now coming out and in their words, pulling the financial fire alarm. That it's just a matter of math. This isn't Republicans and Democrats. This is a math problem now. But do you see what she said? We can't afford to keep paying counties to not utilize their lands and resources. We can't afford to do that. And so we need to open up access to these lands, or, she says, we need to divest the lands and let the states and the counties manage them. Well, amen. Right? There's knowledge. The only thing lacking is courage. That's where this comes from. They know, mostly, there's still some knowledge gaps, but the courage, and that comes from here. And that comes from our governors and our attorney generals and our state representatives, and that's what this movement is about, passing these bills. Knowledge and courage. That comes from our congressional delegation that gains the knowledge, and from you, when you hire them next year, you give them the courage. Right? So, but this is what's happening. You remember in August of 2011, the federal government is pathologically incapable of balancing a budget. In fact, they have not had a balanced budget since before iPads were invented. It's been more than 4 years since the federal government has had a budget, let alone balance it. It's been decades since they balanced one. And so what they did in August of 2011, they came up against the debt ceiling again. There was the downgrade of the credit of the United States. I mean, think about that. The credit was downgraded, and so the proposal was, well, we don't think we could ever balance the budget ourselves, and so we're going to do the Budget Control Act. And what the Budget Control Act says is, if by January 1 of 2013 we can't pass a budget that can cut $85 billion a year of the overspend, we're overspending $1 trillion a year, we're going to cut that by $85 billion. If we can't do that, then automatically there will be automatic cuts of $85 billion a year, and that is called sequestration. You remember New Year's Eve, all the hair on fire in Congress? They couldn't do that. And so sequestration triggered to go into effect on March 1 to cut $85 billion. Do you know that on February 28th, the day before, the federal government overspent $87 billion on that one day? But under sequestration that went into effect, we're going to have automatic across-the-board cuts. What's happening right now is we're cutting money right out of Title I programs, special needs, and the neediest of our children right out of the schools right now. It's happening right now. It's not if or when that 52% that the state of Arizona is reliant upon a fiscally suicidal federal government. It's not if or when, it's right now. Now also in that, you remember that promise that you liked, Supervisor? Because you like 13 apparently more than $1? And that's your revenue. Under the guise of the federal government cutting its expenses, it's now reaching in to your pocket and cutting that payment in lieu of the taxes right now. Now you remember also that if you're North Dakota, you get 100% of your mineral royalty, but dear Supervisor, you apparently liked 48 cents more than $1, or at least so they imposed upon the western states. They're cutting that right now. Now, under the guise of cutting their expense, they're cutting that revenue as well. It's happening right now. Now, the federal mineral lease, we did fortunately have the Western Attorney General begin to band together. And they sent letters and demanded and made the case that you have no right to do that on that program. And they got a letter back just recently that said, you know, maybe you're right, and we'll think about giving your money back in 2014 if nothing else changes. But at least they're banding together, our attorneys general are, and they're beginning to move on this, which is a very, very good thing. Now also, you remember the Not Secure Rural Schools program? Under the guise of cutting federal expenses, they're now reaching in and cutting that revenue. But they're not just stopping at cutting the revenue going forward. Under the Secure Rural Schools program, they're reaching back in time and saying you have to pay back the money you've already spent. That's happening right now. Also happening right now, China is going to countries in South America, countries that owe money to China, and compelling them to auction off hundreds of thousands of acres and all the natural resources to satisfy debt payments to China. Thank heaven they have no idea that we have any resources here in the United States of America. Do we owe any money to China? This is happening right now. This is happening right now. And yet, here's the good part. You were probably waiting for the good part, I'm guessing, right? The good part, this is just earlier this year. The Institute for Energy Research concludes in their study that there's $150 trillion in mineral value locked up in the federally controlled lands. More than 9 times our national debt locked up in the federally controlled lands. Just last year, the Government Accountability Office, the chief auditor of the United States, testifying to Congress, said there is more recoverable oil in Utah, Colorado, and Wyoming than the rest of the world combined, locked up in federally controlled lands. 5 states have now passed legislation to begin instilling knowledge and courage on the federal government to do the same, on our representatives at the federal level, to do the same thing that's already been done with Hawaii and all states east of Colorado. Nevada is one of those. There's Idaho and Montana and Nevada and Wyoming and Utah. Arizona ran a bill in 2012, passed the bill. The bill was an earlier version of the bill that we had proposed that was much more stringent on privatizing land and going that direction. It passed the House and the Senate. It was vetoed by your governor. We've since had some communication with your governor's office and shared some of the knowledge that we're talking about tonight. And you already have in your House and Senate a committee that's beginning to work on formulating a bill much like the bills that have passed in some of the other states to begin studying the transition, the feasibility, and the mechanism for an orderly transfer. That's already happening, but your representatives are going to need more knowledge and courage. Certainly your governor and others, right? Knowledge and courage, and that comes from right here. In Nevada, their transfer of public land, or their public land management task force is made up of county commissioners exclusively, because they're the ones on the ground. And in their first task force meeting, they had Intertech Services, who had already done a comprehensive study on state management of public lands versus federal management of public lands in 1996. And so they presented their 1996 report, and the Nevada task force is employing them to bring that report current. Now, in presenting the report, they said, here's our report from 1996. All of the data that we have currently suggests that as we update this report, the disparity is going to be even greater. And that makes sense, of course, right? States can and do manage public lands profitably. The BLM consistently spends more than it takes in to manage public lands. Now, that's a shock. BLM labor is less efficient than states in managing land, and wildfire suppression costs are greater per acre for the BLM than for states. They analyzed the states. They looked at Arizona and Utah and Nevada and Idaho. And they averaged the high. They took the high, the low, and the average of the revenues and the costs and the expenses of managing public lands at the state level on the left and the BLM on the right. Here's the summary. They conclude that on average, the states managing public land on average per acre yield a positive $6.29 an acre. The BLM on average loses $1.86. Now, we have reports that our school trust lands in Utah, they yield $32 an acre. States managing public land right now. We can't afford not to. You will hear the argument, one of the arguments as to why we shouldn't ever do this is that, well, you can't afford to manage your own lands. What in the world would you ever do without the federal government giving you hundreds of millions of dollars a year to manage your lands? The same federal government that is trying to print prosperity? The same federal government that is broke, that is already cutting back money right out of schools. The same federal government that is already cutting back that promise to pay 13 cents on the dollar, that is already cutting back the promise to pay the 48% of the minimum. You can't. What would we ever do? We can't afford not to. From an environmental quality standpoint, we can't afford not to better manage our lands and forests. Imagine this for a second. Supervisor, you okay if I continue to pick on you a little bit? I got a deal for you, okay? I want you to consider this very carefully. I would like to propose to you that I come and weed your garden and that I pay you for the privilege. Would you be okay with that? I'll pay you $1,000 a month to come and weed your garden for you. You'd be all right with that? That's what we used to do with our forests. That's how we managed our forests. We used to get paid for the privilege of having someone tend that garden for us. And oh, by the way, as they were in the forest and fires would start, they had an incentive to put those fires out because they were already on the ground. We can't afford not to. Because in Arizona, 52% of your revenue, single largest line item of your revenue, comes from a federal government that's broke, and it's not if or when, it's already going away. And if you can do basic math, you can see where that's going. Perhaps then it's time for a new conversation about how we address and deal with our public lands. Perhaps it's time for a new conversation that's not Republican or Democrat. It's about how are we going to educate our children in Arizona. Because Washington, as they continue fiscally suicidal over the fiscal cliff, they're not going to come educate our kids. We probably wouldn't want them to do it anyway. Perhaps it's time for a new conversation about how we better care for our lands and forests and protect the access to our lands that we enjoy and we live and it's been our heritage to use. Perhaps it's time for a new conversation about creating jobs with this resource that was the very foundation of our state and about growing local, state, and national economies. So what do we do? Leverage. Leverage is the key. What does leverage mean? Well, Archimedes in 340. Can we see that? Yeah. He said, give me a lever long enough and a fulcrum on which to place it and I'll move the world. I'll move the world. But what happens all too often is we think, I got to lift the world all by myself. And we go out and I'm going to lift the world all by myself and it gets really hard and we give up. Well, stop it, okay? Just stop it. You're not supposed to lift the world by yourself. We have the most ingenious system that is a republic of republics of republics. And we hire people to leverage our voice and our strength. Perhaps we should tap into that ingenious system that there's nothing like it in the rest of the world. Here's how that works, okay? You raise your voice by all means. What are you going to do next year? You have people that want to work for you. And the job interview questions, why the difference? There's $150 trillion in mineral value locked up that could fund education for our children. There's states that in managing the land, we wouldn't manage them for maximum combustion. We'd actually use that resource to educate children and not burn up millions of animals in the process, not destroy our watershed for generations, not pollute our air. The air quality damage from these fires are worse than all the cars that operate for an entire year from just one of these fires. Yes, absolutely, raise your voice. And in those job interview questions, why the difference? What specifically are you going to do? Who else are you going to bring to the table? How can I help you? Absolutely, emails, phone calls. When you have them in person, absolutely. But then get your family and get your friends. And then go beyond that. Your organizations, groups like this, you've got grassroots groups, you've got Farm Bureau, you've got cattlemen's, you've got chambers of commerce, you have all sorts of organizations locally and nationally. That's turning your one voice into hundreds and thousands. We also have cities doing resolutions, counties doing resolutions, raising their voice, 220,000. It takes your one voice and turns it into 220,000. And raising that voice persistently, counties are doing resolutions all over the West. Sorry, let me back up here for just a second. States are passing resolutions. In fact, I'll show you in a second, states east of Colorado, millions are raising their voice to keep the same promise because of the resources that are at stake. So let me show you what this looks like. This is the Western Growth Coalition, is about 6 cities and 5 chambers of commerce on the west side of Salt Lake. No public land. No public land, but they understand that this is the only solution big enough to actually close a $2 trillion education funding gap, to actually close a that would be really bad, wouldn't it? It's only $2 billion. What am I thinking? A $2 billion education funding gap and a $5 billion gap in our receipts for our state. Here's what they had to say. We urge, this represents probably 600,000 people, 700,000 people. We urge the continued petition of the federal government to honor Utah's compact of statehood as they have with eastern states by disposing of the public lands. The success enjoyed by other states in securing control of their lands was and is the product of a united front and an unequivocal determination to reject no as an answer, or impossible as an answer. These eastern states succeeded in compelling Congress to transfer title of the public lands, and so should we. This is happening all over. In fact, I'll tell you, Washington County, right, St. George, the commissioners in Washington County, they passed a resolution at the county level, and then they had all of the cities within their county pass a resolution. They had their Farm Bureau and their Chamber of Commerce and their school districts are now doing resolutions. And when the governor came down, they had a packet. They said, Governor, we urge you, all of us in our county urge you to exert your utmost abilities to secure the same promise to our state that other states already have. Let me show you this. So, This is your Thomas Maddock again, back in 1932. He said, here's how easy it is. He said, we may not like the fact that our government is controlled by small minorities, but there's no reason that we can't use that in our favor. A very small minority of senators can control the entire appropriation process in Congress. And if we help them with knowledge and with courage, a small group of as few as 10 senators can shut down the entire appropriation process in Congress until we have a real legitimate conversation about honoring the same promise to the western states that they've already kept east, because there's $150 trillion in minerals locked up, because the environmental devastation that's happening in the West. This is South Carolina. South Carolina this year passed a resolution supporting the transfer of public lands to the western states. Now, why would they do that? They're spending $9 billion a year in the east to pay us to not use our own lands and resources to take care of our own children, to take care of our own communities. $150 trillion locked up in the public lands. Where's the heavy equipment going to come from? Where are the legal services and the IT and the financing going to come from? Where's the $150 trillion going to be spent? Will it all be spent in Mohave County? Perhaps not. That's going to trickle throughout the entire nation. In fact, the Homestead Acts, that was the premise of the public lands from the beginning. If you will go on the land and you will make it productive, growing the tax base locally, state, and nationally, will give you the land. Right? That was the premise from the very beginning. They understand that. So, John Dickinson is one of the original founders, little remembered today, unfortunately. He said, the government of each state is and is to be sovereign and supreme. Sovereign and supreme. By the way, there's a Supreme Court case about 12 years ago that says the same thing. States are supreme in their sphere. No more subject to the general government than the general government is subject to them within its limited sphere. And yet we hear all too often from federal agents and others trained in law school that anything the federal government says or does is supreme. That's not our system of government. States are sovereign and supreme in all matters that relate to each state only, and subordinate barely in those matters that relate to the whole, and it will be their own faults if the several states suffer the federal sovereignty to interfere in their jurisdictions. We have no one to blame but ourselves, because we've simply failed to ask the simple question, why? And expect an answer and demand the knowledge and courage to make it happen. I think I have a couple of copies of a little book that I wrote that relates to the rights and the powers and the authorities of the state. They're $10. It's a really great book. I didn't write it to sell or give to anyone else. I wrote it so that I would understand as a state representative what my rights, powers, and authorities are. It's available online. I've got a few copies here. Supervisor Weller has passed out to you a 3x5 card. What I would like you to do, if you would for me, please, you're going to help us revamp our website so that we can help people with this question, what can I do? So on one side of the card, if you would write just a short statement, one specific thing that you could do right now to extend the knowledge and the courage beyond yourself, within your sphere. One side of the card, what can I do? On the other side of the card, I would like you to write one thing that has impressed you about what you've heard tonight. What impressed you the most about what you've heard tonight? So please, and then if you would, if you're willing and interested to allow us to use your name as a testimonial in what impressed you the most, write your name on the card. If you would rather not have your name on that, which is fine, just don't write your name on the card. But that information is very valuable to us. So on one side of the card, what can I do specifically? What can I do in my sphere? How many doors can I open up to move this message forward? And then on the other side of the card, please, what has impressed you the most by what you've heard tonight? As you're writing that, let me give you a couple of ideas, perhaps. Knowledge and courage, right? On the website, there's all kinds of information on the American Lands Council website. It's kind of a geek fest, actually. We just started. I don't sleep anymore. In fact, the other night I was up till 3 o'clock in the morning reading speeches from Senator Henry Clay from 1830 to 1836 on this great national public trust. They're fascinating. I was reading the speech of the Wyoming governor to the Governors Association in 1930, talking about how there was a need for the speedy extinction of the federal title. There's all sorts of things on there. If you ever exhaust all the information on the website, I promise we'll put more there. So the website, great information. The legal analysis, the Federalist Society legal overview, please, please, please take that and share that with your city and county attorneys, with your bar association, your prominent attorneys in town, your government officials, the government affairs people, wherever you can get to. Share that with them and ask for, if they have any critique or comment, please let them know. Supervisor, did I... The handout, that spiral bound, did you have that? Where did that go? Is that right there, or is that something different that's in your book?
I think you might have left it up with mine. Oh, is mine in the back?
Right here. May I? I'll give that back to you, I promise. Okay. So what we're going to send you tonight, I'll send you these slides, so you'll have those and you can share, and there's going to be about 100 bonus slides that we'd be here longer if we went through those. Great information, but we'll send you the slides. I'm also going to send you this. We prepared this for the Western Governors Association. You've got a one-page overview of what we've talked about tonight. Why the difference? Well, your land is arid, of course, and it's rugged, of course. And you gave it up. You just didn't want it. And, of course, you can't manage your own land, and this is clearly unconstitutional, even though it's already been done before and the promises are the same. Now over here, did we really give up our land at statehood? Well, you see, because it says forever disclaim all right and title, but of course that's Nebraska's Enabling Act, and Alabama and Louisiana and North Dakota and South Dakota. And then over here, it's already been done before by Illinois and Missouri and Arkansas and Louisiana, and the excerpt from the Enabling Act of Hawaii, and it's the only solution big enough. Now here then, you've got a 1 to 2 page, so this is a 1-page overview. Then you've got a short 1 to 2 page summary at each of these tabs. So from tab 1, you've got a 1 to 2 page summary here, and then tab 2, 3, and 4. And then here you've got attachments that give you the source documents. This is a veto statement from Andrew Jackson from 1832. Remember, the debt was paid off, and Congress decided that it was going to transfer the land, but it was going to keep the money in Congress, and when the states did what they want, it would give them money. And does that sound familiar? And it passed the House and the Senate, and Andrew Jackson vetoed the bill, and he wrote the single best, most concise contemporaneous history on how the public land question began in 1780. Please, that's a wonderful, in fact, I don't know how much time we have, but if you've got a minute, this is just marvelous. This is out of this veto statement from Andrew Jackson. Listen to this. Here's what he says. I do not doubt that it is the real interest of each and all the states in the Union, and particularly of the new states, that the price of these lands shall be reduced and graduated, and after they've been offered for sale for a certain number of years, the refuse remaining unsold shall be abandoned to the states, and the machinery of our land system entirely withdrawn. No BLM, no Forest Service, no. It cannot be supposed that the compacts, going back to 1780, and the cessions from the states and the enabling acts, it cannot be supposed that the compacts intended the United States should retain forever a title to lands within the states which are of no value. And no doubt it's entertained that the general interest would be best promoted by surrendering such lands to the states. Please read the whole document. It's marvelous. Also, you'll get in the legal analysis. We'll give you an executive summary, about a 5. So you've got the 35-page version of this is on the website, but this is a 5-page version, so you and the lawyers and the others you're going to share this with can get smarter faster. Right? And then the 150 trillion and the dependency of the states, and a comparison side by side of enabling acts and the FBI criminal activity alert, and samples of the resolutions that are being done by farm bureaus and counties and cities and school districts and states are here as well. We'll send that to you, and please make use of it. Knowledge. So the legal analysis. Share the message. How many are on Facebook? Great. Like the Facebook page tonight, please, American Lands Council. Invite 10, 20, everybody that are your friends on your thing, invite them to like the Facebook page. That allows us to get information to you very rapidly. If you tweet, I'm still trying to figure out how to tweet on Twitter and all that sort of thing. But it's an American Lands CN if you do that. But share that message. Can you imagine Thomas Jefferson with a Facebook page? Could you imagine Benjamin Franklin with a YouTube channel? Yeah, I'm positive they never would have slept. Right? Think of the opportunity we have to move this message by whatever means you have. Executive briefings. What we're finding right now, that courage comes most from those that have the governors and the congressional members on speed dial. These are the titans in the community, the Chamber of Commerce types. I'm sure there are several of them here tonight, perhaps. These are the folks that can move that message and demand and instill the courage at the level that, unfortunately, politics today does not lend itself well to risk. Politics at the highest level, at the executive levels, does not lend itself to risk. That courage comes from those who help them get in office the most, and we know where those are. What we're doing is now the executive briefings, the titans of the community, we're asking them for 30 minutes to give them an overview of this, and then answering any questions they may have. And then we ask them two things. Please help with whatever resources you can to move this message forward. This needs to have a mass message campaign. Please help to do that. And then also, you have them on speed dial them and ask them, why? Why are we tolerating this? And so the executive briefings, to the extent, I wish I could be here, I wish I could stay in Arizona and teach and move this more and train others to do this thing, this sort of messaging. But I love my children more than you, and I need to go home. I'm tired. But if you can set up those kinds of executive briefings where you can help leverage my time to come back to larger organizations, if you have your organization of county supervisors and your League of Cities and Towns and your state cattlemen's and farm bureaus and those sorts of things, please arrange with my wife and I'll come back as often as I can. I think I'm already scheduled to be back the first part of February. There's some big campaign thing, and we'll get information back to you on that. Money and manpower move this message. If you can do Facebook and tweet and Twitter and email and your own groups and your own newsletters and whatever you do, please do whatever you can that way. It's going to take money. It's not going to take nearly as much money to tell the truth as it does to tell these sorts of fables that we've been talking about this evening. But it does take that. And so on the website, you can donate on the American Lands Council website, please. This is going to take whatever it takes and to continue to move that forward. Courage. That's the job interview next year, right? It's starting right now. And seriously demand answers. Why the difference? What specifically are you going to do about it? Don't tolerate, I support this 100%, I support it 120%. That's great. The next question is, what specifically are you willing to do, investing your political capital to make this happen? And who else are you bringing to the table, and how can I help you? Those are the job interview questions. Demanding courage, your personal contact emails, phone calls, your groups, the resolutions, the leverage that you're going to bring to the table. It doesn't take a lot to turn your one voice into 220,000 coming from your county, to hundreds of thousands into millions from your state. It really does not take that much. 4 years ago, you guys, I'm a dad, sitting at home frustrated with what's happening. 5 states have passed this legislation. National organizations, Heritage Foundation, the Federalist Society, the State Policy Network, they're all starting to engage on this now because they see this as a working exercise of states beginning to band together as a team to be a roadblock to the federal government and to compel that it honor the same promises. I'm a dad 4 years ago. I really would much rather not be doing this, quite frankly, but we have work to do. That knowledge is a curse as well as a blessing. These executive briefings also in terms of bringing the resources to the table to make that happen. So you now know why the difference, right? Here's where we've been. Federal land management is killing Western communities, and it's threatening our nation. The promises are the same. Our states and the states east of Colorado, it's already been done before, repeatedly. If we fail, to do this, if we fail at this opportunity to do battle, like Thomas Hart Benton, that one man did battle, it won't be because it's impossible or illegal or unconstitutional, but simply because we lack the knowledge and the courage. For the only solution big enough to fund education and govern ourselves, to better care for our lands and forests, to protect the access that's being shut off all over the West, to create real full-time jobs and grow local, state, and national economies. If we fail, we have no one else to blame but us. So, believe it or not, all of this that we've talked about, and you've been so patient and so kind, I was asked to come up to the Wyoming Transfer of Public Lands Task Force in early June, and they said, Representative Ivory, give us all you got. You got the whole day. I said, really? We went for 5 hours without taking a breath, and they said, okay, we'll have you back again some other time. There is so much. And what is really exciting about this is, you know when you know something is true, and the more you look, the more you find, and the more that supports it. That's what we're finding on this, because the public land question is the same from 1780 all the way till now. And if you ask that question why, it's very apparent what needs to happen. So all of that has been distilled down to a 3-minute video. We put like 1,000 pounds of flour in a 5-pound sack. And so now that you have this background, you have a 3-minute video that you can share as far as you can and extend it to introduce people to what's going on. Also on the YouTube channel, the American Lands Council YouTube channel, there is a 10-minute video that we did just a couple of weeks ago for an event in southern Arizona that we talked specifically about Arizona and your percentages and Thomas Maddock and these other things that are going on. And so that's on the YouTube channel. On the website, there are video FAQs. There are little 3-minute videos that answer a number of the questions that people may have. And so, Matt, if we can cue up the little 3-minute video.
Some
please.
people say this movement for the transfer of our public lands is just about selling them off to rich fat cats, or that we can't afford to manage our own lands. The funny thing is, the only people making these arguments are the ones who want to continue to increase federal control over our lands. This is about a failed federal lands policy that is killing Western communities, draining money right out of our kids' education, closing off recreation and grazing access, burning up Western forests, and locking up trillions of dollars in abundant natural resources in Western communities. Don't our children deserve the same opportunities to fund education, grow their economies as children east of Colorado do? This is about the only solution big enough to actually solve these problems, not lobby or litigate for greater federal control over our lands. Have you ever seen this map before? Most people ask, why the difference? Well, that's a great question, because from the founding of our nation until 1976, Congress knew that it was obligated to transfer title to these public lands at statehood. In fact, in the statehood agreement, called an enabling act of every state, Congress reaffirmed that promise to transfer title to the public lands. So if the promise to transfer title to the public lands is the same, why the difference? In 1976, Congress came up with a policy to simply keep all these lands in federal ownership. Now, there's a lot of problems with this policy, including the fact that the Supreme Court recently said unanimously that Congress doesn't have the authority to simply change the promises at statehood, particularly where virtually all of a state's public lands are at stake. When Congress changed its lands policy, it promised to pay Western communities for not utilizing their lands and forests and other resources to fund education and roads and other public services. Did you know that with so much land under federal control, some communities have less than 10% taxable land? Well, guess what? The federal government is broke here, and now it's reneging on these promises to Western communities to pay them for not utilizing their lands. It's shutting off even more access for recreation and grazing, locking up literally trillions of dollars in abundant natural resources in the West. Federal forest policies prevent harvesting any trees, even when they've been killed by beetle devastation. This is causing raging wildfires, polluting the air, killing millions of animals, and devastating watershed for decades. Once Congress keeps its promise, federal public lands become state public lands, protecting access for recreation and hunting and fishing and grazing, and opening up access to our abundant natural resources to create jobs, fund education, and grow local, state, and national economies. Making Congress keep its obligation to transfer our public lands, just like it already did with Hawaii and all states east of Colorado, really is the only solution big enough. Today, some billionaire is going to write $1 million check to some extremist organization to keep you from accessing and using your Western lands. Today, those same extremist organizations are going to file lawsuit after lawsuit and then settle, creating new policy that shuts down your access and use to your Western lands. Today, some federal bureaucrat or agency is going to unroll a new policy that shuts off your access and use to your Western lands. What are you going to do today?
So let me tell you how simple this is, okay? 2 weeks ago, I had the honor as a reforming lawyer to have Justice Scalia as my warm-up act in Bozeman, Montana. The program would reflect that Justice Scalia was the keynote speaker for the establishment of the Federalist Society in Montana, and I followed him with whoever was left. And that's my story, I'm sticking to it. But I got 10 minutes with Justice Scalia. And I showed him this little card. And I said, I'm a representative from the state of Utah, and I'm working to get the federal government to honor the same promise to our state and our children that they've already kept with all states east of Colorado. He was such a genuine man. I mean, just very approachable. And he zeroed right in on that red, and he said, is it really? Is that what it really looks like? I said, yeah. He says, really? I said, yeah. He said, I didn't know it was that bad. I said, yeah, most people don't realize that Illinois and Missouri and Arkansas and Louisiana, they were as much as 90% federally controlled for decades until one man with courage, in his own words, went to battle. And they're less than 5% federally controlled today. And without missing a beat, without wringing his hands and stewing over it, Justice Scalia said, the federal government has no business owning all those lands. It needs to get rid of them. Right? 1 down, 4 to go, right? Think of how simple this is. The promises are the same. It's already been done before. It's the only solution big enough. So, let's see if we've got, do we have one more? Here we go. The texting that there. This is that. Let me just finish with this. I've now cursed you with knowledge. Perhaps I've blessed you with knowledge. The courage comes from you. And the courage to your state leaders must come from you. But think about what Ronald Reagan said in 1987. Height of the Cold War, right? Nuclear proliferation, red phones, and the tension. And Ronald Reagan made this statement that I think if he were here today, we would receive the same counsel from him that I think is more appropriate today than it was then. He said, this is a wonderful time to be alive. We're lucky not to live in pale and timid times. We've been blessed with the opportunity to stand for something. For liberty and freedom, and I would submit property. And these are things worth fighting for, worth devoting our lives to. So let us go forth with good cheer and stout hearts, happy warriors, out to seize back a country and a world to freedom. Thank you very much. You've been very, very kind. I'd be happy to answer any questions. You've been very kind. We've been here late. I'll stay as long as questions you may want to ask.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for being here.
Thank you. And you emailed.